Our next topic is Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe. Though written before Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels by 7 years, this text constitutes the archetype of the early 18th century novel and another monument in the development of this form, the novel. We're primarily going to be addressing two other lectures, rather long ones, one by Professor Oliver of Essex, an excellent lecture that covers almost all the main points, and another lecture that I delivered with the help of my colleagues. Those will give you some of the nuts and bolts, the details that will help you understand this text. In this brief overview, I'll just run through some of the major themes and read the first few pages of the novel, its preface, as well as its opening chapter. Defoe is something of an accidental novelist. He did not think of himself as a fiction writer or a novelist, although there were some very early entries in that form, such as Orinoco by Alfred Ben. He was mostly an experimentalist in terms of writing every possible form. You can see here on the British Library's biography of him that he wrote some 318 publications of every imaginable sort: political pamphlet, travel literature, made-up biography, nonfiction report, until towards the end of his life in the 17 teens. He lived pretty much the same years as Jonathan Swift. He lands upon this fictionalized travel form and writes Robinson Crusoe, which is published in 1719. So he's not someone who is seeking to innovate in a literary way. He's just a literary fount. He's part of this explosion of print culture in the early 18th century, with using that same kind of society and means that we discussed with Addison, printing these circles of reading, and provides as kind of an impresario, a businessman of writing. He goes through various professions in his career, many different ones, and he lands and he produces the novel almost as an appeal to his ever-growing readership, as a way of reaching them, although it's hardly by design. The text itself doesn't ever claim to be written by Defoe either. It is, if anything, another milestone, another landmark in those developing experimental novels, in this emerging genre that doesn't have a conception of the novelist, of the author, as distinct. Even these terms, novel, only developed a generation later. And the text, as you can see in this frontispiece of the first edition, you can see there the year in Roman numerals 1719. It is written by Robinson Crusoe himself, who is stated here to be an actual person. Few things to note about this frontispiece. First of all is the proud, imperial, imposing figure in the engraving here, with his 2 muskets, his saber, his sword, the shipwrecked on the side. You can see the trace of one of his habitations. You'll recall that Robinson Crusoe has 2 homes on his island. Dressed in his shag hair coat, and with his in the exotic, he doesn't have his shoes on, but dominating the landscape, armed to the teeth, and fully capable. This is not the depressed, scrambling Crusoe of the early chapters, but the imperial ruler of his domain. That question of becoming the king of your own world is something that Professor Oliver addresses in her lecture. On the title page, The Life and Strange Surprise and Adventures of Robinson Crusoe. Like Gulliver's Travels, it has a more elaborate title than the one we commonly use. It tells you exactly where he's from, of York, mariner. He is a sailor from a specific city in England, who lived 28 years all alone in an uninhabited island on the coast of America, near the mouth of the great river Orinoco here, having been cast on shore by shipwreck, wherein all the men perished but himself, with an account of how he was at last strangely delivered by pirates, written by himself. What else is there to read? This title page tells you, and I'll offer it to you here in the version that we have through our library, somewhat more clear in black and white. This facsimile tells you the entire plot on the title page. Every spoiler, the entire plot spoiler, is delivered in this first printing. What happened to him, how long, what's going to happen, the suspense is completely relieved. Obviously, this text was read, and it was read avidly by many, was read for a different reason than simply to find out what happened, but rather how it happened, and maybe even why. It is an adventure. It's clearly the kind of exotic and intrepid tale that the readers, whom we'll discuss in just a second, would have been eager to undertake. People like Robinson Crusoe, but never left England, and in Pirates, Orinoco being in South America, also the setting of Aphra Behn's Orinoco. It is a tale that has adventures, but it is of just a man. Robinson Crusoe is utterly ordinary. There is nothing distinguishing about him. He is not aristocrat. He's not especially endowed with any other trait, wealth, or capacity that would have distinguished himself from the main body of the readership. These middle station that I'm also going to describe. It is therefore why make it public? Well, really because it's just entertaining. But the entertainment has to be redeemed, and you can see here in the preface, by a kind of moral. The wonders, it should be the editor, of course it is Defoe, thinks that it's worth making the wonders of this man's life public for a greater good. The story is told with modesty, with seriousness. It is very boring to many of us today to read. It is told with a religious application of the events to make men wise. Remember what Addison said, to enliven morality with wit. Here it is taking what is adventure, entertainment, and saying it can be justified by the example, the wisdom of providence. These terms, as both I and Professor Oliver make clear, are key ideas: providence, adventures, and the circumstances. Like Gulliver's Travels, it is claimed to be authentic. It's just as the publisher wrote about Gulliver's Travels, it has the appearance of truth. Here it seems to be a just history of fact. This is just the chronicles, just the facts. There is nothing embellished here. There is nothing invented here. This is true. There is no appearance of fiction. Fiction as if something that needs to be repressed, denied, something that is inferior. The instruction, however, is what makes it so useful to the reader. And what is the instruction? Well, let's take a look inside. So this idea of fiction, entertainment, and moral, dogma, these are key ideas in the doctrine of the rise of the novel, as hopefully you're reading as well and starting to understand your own. How does it operate? Let's look a little bit at the machinery the technique in the opening pages of the text. The life and adventures of Robinson Crusoe, here it is right at the beginning. I was born, it's told in his voice, right? There's no other author here. Again, Crusoe is speaking. In a specific year, it is, as Professor Oliver says, long enough back in memory, this is text published in 1719, that no one in living memory could attest to this. So the events happened during the Civil War, during that period of tumult, also a period that Defoe himself visited in a very interesting text called Journal of the Plague Year, which is completely fictitious, made up account as if someone of that period were recovering all those health records, something, of course, of interest to us with our recent experience of plague, but it's set back 2 generations before. I was born in a specific year in a specific place to a specific family. This is what we're going to read about Ian Watt calls the formal realism, giving enough detail to give it the aura, the appearance of fact, creating a specific detail, the particularities that will make it universally appropriate, universally understood, and more authentic, more real. It even says, however, that I was not from a long-standing English family. My father was German. He was an immigrant, a foreigner from Bremen who first settled at Hull and had changed the name from Kreutzer, which means cross or crosser, Kreuznäher, to Crusoe. This significance sort of in the etymology of his name being crosser is of course important both in crossing the globe, his voyaging, and the providential or Christian aspect of the story. That religious narrative is going to be another key theme that we will address. He has brothers, they die, they go into the army, and he is the third son. He can't quite find what to do. Okay, but he has an inclination to go out to sea. It's an inclination, as he says here, that is against the will, the commands of his father. He is abrogating, he's violating his father's wishes, and they wanted him to stay home. My father is going to set him down. So here this is the narrative element of being sort of a prodigal son, the original sin of his life, of Crusoe's narrative. He's done some sin here. His sin is that he's going to go against his father's advice, and here it is. His father exhorts him. He tells him, "Come." He says, "Come into." And though he was sick, why I have this sort of uncontrollable desire, this inclination, this bad will to travel and leave my father's house to father countries, whereas I could just stay home and by raise my fortune through the enterprise, the prosperity of England in this era, the rising middle class, the rising bourgeoisie, the expanding prosperity of the mainland, of the homeland of England, I could just buy through application and industry with a life of ease and pleasure. These are the goals, and has religious significance also. As we'll discover, economic flourishing is also religious benediction. It is to be favored by God. People of desperate fortune are people who go off and seeking adventure abroad. These were all either things that are far too above me, only the rich people, the nobility can do that, or too far below me, desperate people. Mine was the middle station, it says here. Find that on the page. Mine was the middle state, or one could be called the upper station of low life, which he had found, my father said, by long experience was the best state in the world. It is the best to be in that middle station, the most suited to human happiness, not exposed to miseries and hardships, the labor and sufferings of the merchant part of mankind, and not embarrassed with the pride, luxury, ambition, and envy of the upper part of mankind. He told me I might judge of the happiness of this state by this one thing, that this was the state of life which other people envied, that kings have frequently lamented the consequences of being born to great things, and wished they had been placed into the middle of the two extremes. This middle state, these mercantile, middling station, are the readers, the subjects, and, for the most part, the authors of the novel. It is the world of the novel. People who are insulated from, as it says here, the pride, the great ambitions, the international affairs of the upper state, and the miseries of the poor. This middle state is what Crusoe seems to abandon. He turns his back on it. That is what he says. I will eventually have had much. By leaving it is what brought disaster upon me, and then I had plenty of leisure to cogitate on what turned out to be a very prophetic warning by my father. So says Crusoe, and then it offers that middle station where it's this comfortable state, this mercantile, rather increasingly complacent and prosperous station. Those are the people to whom this text is actually addressed. When Crusoe travels to this exotic land, he engages in all of these, what Max Weber, an important 20th century sociologist, called the Protestant Epic. He engages in the kind of enterprise, application, that the father had spoken about, and he eschews luxury and extravagance in order to set up a prosperous household for himself alone in his society of one. What he effectively creates, Crusoe does, is a new English estate in the exotic tropical world in the Caribbean. He is a British imperialist of one. The natural state of the world that he recreates is England. It's precisely to recreate what his father said, just stay home and do this, but he creates it abroad. One other brief element about this is the idea that that there is a kind of religious recompense for all this. That it is by turning his back on his father that he eventually, right, as he says here, I observed in the last part of his discourse, that my father did not know what he was saying, but these middle bourgeois people who say, just stay home and make money and help the family out, turn out to have a kind of Christian moral to it. His tears run down, and Crusoe says, although I was affected by it, eventually he disdains his father's words, and God, so to speak, takes revenge and gives him plenty of opportunity to think about his sin. So the religious and the economic, the imperial and the individual, how this text, which is really just about one individual, I'll talk about this with my colleague, Dr. Kara Klatt, about one individual becomes a lens onto an entire society, and how this very painstaking text with all kinds of lists and self-flagellation and details about how to hunt and create a home, and of course the natives towards the end, how this very detailed text becomes the progenitor of an entire form that we call today the novel.